What would you do if your 4-year-old child, after taking a sip of milk in the morning, collapsed right in front of you and whispered their final words? "Daddy put something in the milk." Lisa never imagined that just 10 minutes after trusting in something that seemed so harmless, her entire world would explode. That morning started like any other. The soft hum of the vacuum cleaner moved across the living room floor. Pale sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, lighting up Ethan's face as he squinted with a big smile. "Drink it, Ethan. But remember, this is just between you and Daddy. Don't tell Mommy, okay?" The man's voice was deep and steady, not loud but firm in a way that couldn't be refused. The little boy looked up, still smiling, and reached out for the familiar cup with the dinosaur pattern. The white liquid inside swirled slightly, giving off a gentle warmth. Ethan sipped. The taste was a little strange, but not unpleasant. He didn't say anything, just took a big gulp and smiled again with his eyes nearly closed. Marcus crouched down beside him and gave his son's head a soft pat. He glanced toward the hallway, catching the faint sound of the vacuum cleaner still running in the living room. He stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on the towel draped over the back of a chair. His expression was calm, like he'd just made his son a regular morning cup of milk. In his hand, he held the lid of an empty milk carton, the kind made for adults, not Ethan. In the fridge, the carton meant for Ethan was still there, unopened, its label clearly marked dairy-free for severe allergies. The other carton, its label had been peeled off earlier, was nearly empty, with just a few drops clinging to the bottom. Across the room, Lisa, Ethan's mother, was crouched down, wiping under the chairs. She looked up at the sound of footsteps and asked quietly, without turning, "You used the right milk, didn't you?" "Yeah, the one with the little blue sticker," Marcus replied, his tone even and unhurried. Lisa nodded slightly and went back to her task. Nothing struck her as odd, not odd enough to stop, not odd enough to name the nagging feeling. Ethan was still there, and Marcus, though distant lately, was still her husband. Less than 10 minutes later, the first sound that shattered the quiet morning was the sharp crash of glass breaking. Lisa's head snapped around. She shot to her feet. Then came the coughing, a dry, choking sound, followed by a string of short, frantic gagging. Small footsteps stumbled, and then fell silent. She ran toward the living room. Ethan was lying face down on the floor, his arms curled in tight, his lips turning a bluish gray. His cheeks were blotched red, and his neck was covered in a rash. His eyes were shut tight, and his breathing dragged, each gasp weak and strained. A streak of milky white fluid still leaked from the corner of his mouth. "Ethan!" Lisa screamed, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she turned his little body over. His skin was burning hot, but his breath came shallow like a thread unraveling. From the corner of her eye, she caught sight of the hallway. Marcus was standing there. Leaning against the kitchen doorway, his hand still holding the refrigerator door. His eyes didn't blink. He didn't move toward them, didn't ask a single question. "Marcus, call an ambulance." He blinked, slowly, as if waking from a dream. Lisa didn't wait. She yanked the phone from her pocket and punched in 911. Her hands were shaking violently, but her voice, when it came through the receiver, was the last thing she could hold steady. "My son, he's having an allergic reaction. He can't breathe. It's an emergency." Marcus remained frozen, like a statue. The room turned cold, not from the breeze slipping through the window, but from something breaking inside Lisa. Her left hand gripped Ethan's small fingers. Her right cradled the back of his neck, trying to keep him conscious. She bent forward, her forehead resting gently against his temple. "Ethan, baby, I'm right here. I'm not leaving you," she whispered, each word catching in her throat. "I won't let anyone hurt you. Do you hear me?" The small body in her arms twitched again. Just a faint involuntary jerk. Ethan let out a soft hiccup. His eyelids fluttered, and his lips moved. Dry, barely shaping sound. Lisa leaned in closer, pressing her cheek to his mouth, straining to catch even the faintest whisper, anything. "Dad," the word drifted out like a final breath, so thin it could have been the air sucked through a vent. "Put Something? The boy's lips trembled as he forced out each piece, like every syllable weighed more than he could bear. In the milk. Lisa froze. The words came out uneven, incomplete, but they were sharp enough to cut through her like a blade. In that moment, it was as if all the noise inside the ambulance pulled back, leaving only those 3 words, echoing in the air, in her blood, in her mind. She lowered her hand to Ethan's chest. He was still breathing, but just barely, like a thread of smoke. His small frame lay limp in her arms, flushed and ice-cold all at once, the very image of the allergic reaction she'd once been warned about, though never imagined she'd witnessed so clearly. The ambulance kept speeding forward, red and blue lights flickering through the tiny window in the rear door. A young EMT was trying to keep Ethan's airway open, holding the oxygen mask firmly in place. Lisa had no tears left. She just clung to his hand, whispering his name again and again, trying to hold him here. Then, the boy's eyelids parted, just a sliver, like lightning cracking through cloud. And over the steady hiss of the oxygen machine, Lisa heard a sound, faint but unmistakable to her, because it was her son's voice. "Dad, put something in the milk." The voice was so faint it was barely more than a breath, but it hit her harder than any sound could have. Lisa froze, lifting her head to stare at her son. Ethan had drifted off again, his breathing even shallower now. There was nothing accidental about what he said. It wasn't delirium. Ethan never lied, and he wasn't the kind of child to imagine something like that. Lisa's chest tightened, a cold ache slowly rising from her ribs. A string of images flashed through her mind, fast but terrifyingly clear. Marcus bending down, handing the cup to Ethan. Ethan giggling. That one short, quiet sentence loaded with meaning, just our little secret. And the unlabeled milk carton. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. This time there was no room left for doubt. Everything was lining up like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. Marcus knew Ethan was allergic. They'd once rushed him to the ER because of a trace of butter in a cookie. He was the one who always held the key to the fridge. He was the one who'd made the rule. Mom handles the meals, Dad controls the fridge for safety. So why had he kept her out of the kitchen this morning? Why the rush to make the milk? Why the smile? Lisa pulled her phone from her coat pocket. The screen showed her most recent call, 911, placed exactly 10 minutes ago. Her fingers trembled slightly, but this time she didn't redial. She opened the search bar, typed 911 again. Her heartbeat was steadier now, not from calm, but from a sharp and focused resolve. The call connected. 911, what's your emergency? Lisa swallowed hard. Her voice came out strangely calm, each word slow, cold. I already called an ambulance. Now I need the police. Please describe the situation. She took a breath. This time there was no hesitation. My husband. I believe my husband may have intentionally poisoned our son using cow's milk. My son has a severe dairy allergy. This morning my husband made the milk, and right before he lost consciousness, my son whispered, "Dad, put something in the milk." On the other end, the dispatcher paused for a few seconds, then responded, professional, tense. Please provide the suspect's full name and your exact address. Lisa answered like someone who had rehearsed her response long ago. His name is Marcus Sloan. He's currently at work, 5th floor, Qtran Logistics Building, 8th Avenue. We've received the information. The patrol unit will reach the target in 8 to 10 minutes. Are you with the child? I'm in the ambulance on the way to Franklin Hospital with my son. He's still breathing but weak. We'll coordinate with the hospital immediately. Please stay in contact and thank you for reporting this. Lisa hung up. Her hand dropped to her thigh, the phone slipping down near her foot. She closed her eyes. She wasn't afraid anymore. No more hesitation. The dream of a perfect family she once fought to preserve had cracked long ago. Now it shattered completely, without a sound. She looked at Ethan again. The boy was still breathing, shallow, raspy, but alive. Lisa leaned close, pressing her cheek against his forehead. She said nothing, just silence, as if she were trying to stitch each of his breaths into her own body. And in that moment, she understood with painful clarity. What Ethan said wasn't an accusation, it was a cry for help. The last words he could manage offered to the one person he still hoped might hear him. And Lisa had heard him, and with that, the curtain over the truth began to lift, turning what once seemed peaceful into the heart of a storm. The fifth-floor office of Qtran Logistics was bathed in the cold glow of fluorescent lights, clear glass walls, a tidy conference table. Everything spoke of a professionalism so polished, it felt soulless. At 9:30 a.m., Marcus Sloan was presenting the next quarter's distribution strategy, a laser pointer gliding steadily across the LED screen at the end of the room. He had just wrapped up a section of the presentation when the door swung open. 3 police officers stepped in, black vests on, radios clipped to their shoulders, saying nothing more than necessary. The packed meeting room froze, as if someone had hit pause on the whole scene. Marcus remained standing, laser pointer still in hand, one eyebrow slightly raised. "Marcus Sloan?" the lead officer asked. Marcus gave a faint chuckle and stepped away from the table. "What is this? Someone staging a reality show prank or something?" No one replied. One of the officers held out a detention notice. "You are suspected of willfully endangering the life of a child. You have the right to remain silent and to have an attorney present." The silence in the room grew so thick, the metallic snap of the handcuffs seemed to echo. Eyes widened. The HR manager stammered, He was just presenting like normal." "I thought his kid was hospitalized this morning." Marcus gave a short nod, glancing briefly over his shoulder. His voice was calm, measured, almost like he was still giving his presentation. "The boy had a mild allergic reaction. My wife overreacted, as usual." "Then why didn't you go to the hospital with him?" a female colleague blurted out. Marcus turned toward her, a faint smile touching his lips, half contempt, half pity. "There are times when a father needs to act with composure. The boy will be fine. I have work to do." Then he turned to the officers, calmly extending his hands for the cuffs. "Yes, I switched his formula, but if a little cow's milk knocks him down, then he needs to learn to toughen up. The world out there doesn't make accommodations for anyone." No one said a word. At Franklin Hospital, at that very moment, Lisa sat motionless on the plastic chair in the emergency room. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the space, and the stark white light carved every emotion into cold, sterile slices. Ethan lay on the bed, small, still, his face blotched with red welts from the allergic reaction. The door opened. A doctor stepped in, holding a chart, his face tense but composed. "We've stabilized the anaphylactic reaction. He'll need close monitoring for the next 24 hours, but there's no immediate danger now." Lisa nodded, her eyes never leaving her son. "We also just received the blood test results," the doctor continued, his voice slowing. "There's a clear presence of casein, a major protein found in cow's milk. A reaction this severe could only happen if he consumed a significant amount." Lisa lowered her head. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't a distracted father. This was someone deliberately hurting his own child, then slipping on his shoes, heading to work, walking into the office, like it was just another Monday morning. When the police called to confirm, "We've taken Marcus Sloan into custody," Lisa said only 3 words. "Thank you, officers." She placed her hand on Ethan's forehead, resting her face close to his. She said nothing, no tears. Only one thing remained perfectly clear in her heart. Marcus wasn't a father who made a mistake. He was a man who chose to do something wrong, then walked away from it like nothing ever happened. Night had fallen. In the intensive care unit, the lights had been dimmed halfway, leaving only a pale white glow casting down on the small pair of hands still receiving fluids. Lisa sat close beside her child's bed, her eyes never leaving him. Ethan was in a deep sleep. His breathing had grown more steady, but each breath was still faint, his chest rising and falling as if he had to push through a heavy sheet of glass just to inhale. She hadn't eaten all day. Her stomach was hollow, her mouth dry, but it was as if her body had shut off all physical sensations, making room for something heavier, slower. Something she wasn't ready to name yet, but that was spreading through her chest, the shattering of a trust that had taken years to build. She tried to stay grounded in the present, in the monitor, in Ethan, in the steady beeping, but in her mind the images from that morning played over and over like a broken reel of film. She clung to one moment in particular, the look in his eyes when he stood in the doorway. He didn't run over, didn't panic, didn't rush. He just stood there, cold, almost as if he were observing. And then, without telling anyone, without leaving a single word, Marcus walked out of the house. He changed his shirt, put on cologne, got in his car, and drove to the office. Lisa asked herself, where is the man I once loved? The man who used to text her every morning before work. Leave it for me, take a break. The man who recorded lullabies for Ethan so they could play when the baby cried and she wasn't home. The man who spent hours picking out curtains for the nursery and said, I don't want sunlight hurting his eyes. But those memories no longer stood alone. They were crowded now, pushed aside by other images, scattered ones that Lisa had once brushed off as no big deal, once excused with, he's just tired, or that's how men show love. Marcus yelling at Ethan for falling off his bike, not cleaning the scrapes, just yanking him up and saying, don't cry. Men don't get to cry. Marcus snatching the spoon from Ethan's hand, giving his little arm a sharp tap when he wouldn't eat his vegetables. You want to grow up? Then learn to listen. There was even a time Lisa had spoken up. Don't do that. He's scared. Marcus had turned and looked at her with eyes like knives. You want to raise a weakling or a real man? Back then, she had backed down after those small fights, told herself, he's only strict because he wants what's best for our son. But now, every word came back, and they no longer sounded like the firm advice of a father raising his child. They felt like bricks, laid one by one, building a silent structure of control she had never dared to call by its true name. On the other side of the city, inside an interrogation room with a two-way mirror, Marcus Sloan sat leaning back in his chair, his hands cuffed on the icy stainless steel table. The ceiling lights cast a harsh white glow onto his expressionless face. He stared directly at Detective Sarah Moreno, who had been following the case from the beginning, with a flat, unreadable look, as if this were just another end-of-day meeting. Moreno wasn't in a hurry. She placed the file folder down and flipped through the pages slowly, deliberately, letting Marcus hear the sound of paper gliding over the plastic cover. Then she paused. Do you understand why your son whispered those 3 words? She asked. Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked up at the ceiling as if weighing something in his mind. Then, after a few seconds, he spoke in an even, untroubled tone. Because I made him do something he didn't want to. I was teaching him to be a man, not some weak kid living in a glass bubble. Moreno said nothing. She didn't take any notes. She simply closed the file and stood up. Marcus remained seated, eyes wide open, no blinking, no anger, no remorse. At the hospital, Lisa was still there, her hand never leaving Ethan's. And in the quiet light of nightfall, a thought settled in her mind. Love wasn't what blinded people. What blinded her was the way Marcus had used love as a cover, a leash, tying her to the role of a wife who had to endure, a mother who had to stay silent, a child who had to be strong by his definition. She didn't cry because tears couldn't ease the fury rising in her chest. And in that moment of silence, she knew she had woken up, not just for Ethan, but for herself. Ethan wasn't fully conscious yet, but Lisa saw his eyelids flicker, just a faint twitch, in a fragile moment between the lingering fever and awareness. The small hand in hers was no longer icy cold, but his skin remained pale, like watered-down milk. The only thing keeping her grounded was the steady, rhythmic beeping of the monitor. From morning until night, Lisa barely moved. She didn't sleep, didn't go to the bathroom, didn't respond to anyone's messages, except for a single call to her lawyer. Her heart was straining every second, trying to make sense of it all. Not just what Marcus had done, but why. She could still hear Ethan's whisper that morning, so faint it felt like the wind could carry it away. "Daddy, put something in the milk." It wasn't an accusation. It was the last desperate effort of a child with no one else to cling to. She remembered Marcus's eyes that morning, calm. No hesitation, no sweat, not even a raised voice. He hadn't panicked because he wasn't surprised. He didn't stay because he had nothing to fear. She used to think she was married to a quiet, stern man, a bit harsh maybe, but those weren't just personality traits. Not anymore. They were fractures that had widened year by year, and she'd been too busy patching them up with love to notice the whole foundation was rotting beneath her feet. The hospital room door opened. A young nurse stepped in, checked the IV, glanced at the monitor, and froze. Ethan's heart rate was suddenly spiking. "Where's the attending?" She called into her radio, her voice tight with alarm. "Pediatric bed 12, cardiac response, get the adrenaline ready." Lisa shot up from her chair, her heart pounding as if it might break out of her chest. Her hands trembled as she reached for Ethan, who had just started to moan softly. But it only lasted a second before his little body jolted violently. His hands clawed at the bedsheet, as if fighting off something invisible tightening around his neck. His body twisted in sharp, unnatural rhythms. A faint foam began to gather at the corners of his mouth. In less than 20 seconds, Ethan's skin went from pale to a deep, blotchy red, then began turning bluish around his lips and eyes. His pupils started drifting off-center, and the pulse in his neck thudded erratically. Lisa screamed, "Ethan! Mommy's here! I'm right here!" Her voice cracked just as the monitor began to shriek, that piercing alarm sharp as a knife, signaling that life was slipping away. A nurse burst into the room, calling an emergency code over the intercom. The door flew open. 2 doctors rushed in, pushing a crash cart, murmuring to themselves as they double-checked the injection doses, like they were racing the child's failing heartbeat. "Pulse is dropping," one doctor shouted, while the other held Lisa back and plunged adrenaline into Ethan's thigh. All Lisa could do was hold her son. Her hands, slick and trembling, kept slipping from the small, cooling arm. She screamed inside her head. No words, no coherent thoughts, just a raw, primal terror, like a mother animal watching a predator tear away her only child. At the county police headquarters, Marcus Sloan sat in interrogation room 3. The fluorescent light above beamed straight onto his forehead, casting sharp shadows that deepened the lines at the corners of his eyes. His shirt, worn since early morning, was crumpled, the top 3 buttons undone, his loosened tie draped across the table. He had been there for nearly 7 hours, not because he didn't have a lawyer, but because the police still had him classified as high risk, flight risk, repeat offender risk, and most critically, a risk to the key witness, the 4-year-old boy still lying in the hospital, his biological son. Marcus's private attorney, Daniel Krell, a man known for high-stakes financial negotiations, walked in this time with a very different look. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses and a worn-out suit, his eyes were tense, stripped of their usual calm. He sat down, opened the file, and tapped his pen lightly on the table. "The police won't release you, Marcus. They've turned the case over to the district attorney's office. There's physical evidence, the tainted milk, the nurse's testimony, allergic reactions, blood analysis, and then there's your son's statement." Marcus leaned back, arms crossed, his voice rough. "They're making this up. Lisa's always been weak, turned our kid into a coward. She never understood what it takes to raise a strong boy. My father did worse to me." Krell didn't respond right away. He pulled out a document from the folder and placed it in front of Marcus. It was a 2021 internal investigation notice from New York State Child Protective Services, originally filed anonymously, later confirmed to have come from their former housekeeper, Cecilia Evans. Marcus looked at the paper and gave a crooked smile. "I fired her, told her never to come back. People think just because they've been a mother for a few years, they've earned the right to lecture others." Krell slid over another paper, a short report with a recorded threat. The voice was unmistakably Marcus's, directed at Cecilia. "You don't get to question how I raise my son. If you interfere again, I'll see to it you lose your job. and you're home." At that moment, Krell closed the file and lowered his voice. "Marcus, do you realize that everything you've said, not just to me but also to the police, only reinforces the exact image they're trying to prove? A man with money, power, a controlling nature, and no remorse." Marcus let out a dry laugh. "I have nothing to feel remorse for. A child should learn to overcome fear." "If he's scared of milk now, what's next? He'll fear society later. Lisa's weak, and she's teaching him to be weak too. I don't regret it. I'm just protecting him in my own way." With that cold testimony, devoid of admission, full of justification under the guise of tough love, Marcus was immediately placed in custody without bail. Inspector Sarah Moreno, the lead officer on the case, noted in her report, "The suspect shows no remorse and displays a dangerous, systematic need for control. He should not be allowed near his family, especially not children." When Lisa received the update from her attorney, "He's denied bail and his own testimony is working against him," she exhaled quietly, not out of satisfaction, not out of relief, because she knew that the law alone wouldn't be enough. She still had a long road ahead to reclaim her life and teach Ethan that gentleness is never weakness. Near dawn, the lights in the hospital room dimmed, leaving only a soft golden glow around the hospital bed. Lisa was still there, sitting motionless, her head resting beside her son's arm, her eyes dry from tears long since spent. Then, a tiny movement broke the heavy silence. Ethan's finger curled slightly. Lisa lifted her head, holding her breath. He stirred again. His eyelids fluttered, then slowly parted, just a sliver but enough for Lisa to know. Ethan was awake. His eyes were still clouded and tinged with red, like frosted glass catching the morning, but they were searching for something. Lisa leaned in close, her hand gently cradling his cheek. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath, careful not to shatter the fragile moment.
"Mommy's here."
Ethan's eyes moved. His lips quivered, but he didn't have the strength to speak. There was only the faintest breath, like a breeze sliding across the throat.
"Mom."
Lisa leaned closer, her lips trembling, but her hand stayed firm around his, steady, calm, holding on with everything she had. The boy raised a weak finger, pointing to the right, toward a small drawing table set up for children in recovery. Lisa turned her head and saw a sheet of paper tilted beside a box of crayons. She stood up and gently picked it up. The drawing was messy but clear. 3 human figures, one tall, one with long hair, one very small. And between them, a large, dark cup of milk, slashed through with jagged red lines. Nearby, a black swirl like a thundercloud pressed down on top of the milk. Lisa stared at the picture for a long time. When she turned back, Ethan had closed his eyes, but his voice murmured again, faint, broken, as if breath alone brushed the edges of the words. "Secret. Dad. Milk." She held her breath. Each word was like a small blade driven into her chest, not from shock, not even surprise anymore, but from the deep, quiet pain of knowing a child had to whisper something that should never have been hidden. Lisa sat down beside the bed, took his tiny leaf-like hand, and pressed it to her cheek. She didn't cry, but her eyes shimmered, like there were slow waves stirring under the surface of a lake no longer still. She kissed his forehead and whispered softly, slowly, letting each word settle in him like a promise. "You did the right thing. No matter what anyone says, I believe you. I'm right here." Ethan didn't answer, but this time his breathing was steady. He was alive, and he had found the courage to speak. 8 a.m. The county holding cell was silent, save for the hard clack of leather shoes on tile and the cold, sterile smell of disinfectant. Marcus Sloan sat motionless at the wooden table, his hands still cuffed, though looser now after a long night without resistance. He hadn't slept at all, not from fear of jail, but from a nightmare that had no shape, no image. Just a deep, endless darkness. And in it, Ethan kept calling out a single word, "Mom." The door opened. Marcus looked up, and the sharp edge in his eyes crumbled in an instant. Gerald Sloan, his biological father, stepped in like a drawn blade. The man was in his 70s, silver hair neatly combed, tie pulled high, wristwatch aligned to the mark. He didn't sit, he didn't shake hands, he didn't offer a hug. He simply stood behind the empty chair across from Marcus and said, just loud enough to be heard, "You're dragging the Sloan name through the dirt with this pathetic stunt." Marcus swallowed hard. His throat was dry as paper. "My son almost died, Dad. And you show up here for the family name? He didn't die. I didn't die. Neither did you. We survive because we don't give it, but you're making a scene over a kid with an allergy." "It wasn't an allergy," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "It was anaphylactic shock. He stopped breathing for nearly 5 minutes. Gerald gave a cold snort. "There you go again, getting sentimental. I had hoped at the very least you wouldn't let emotion rule you like your mother did, but in the end, her blood won out." Marcus clenched his fists. The chain on the cuffs rattled. His eyes reddened, not with rage, but with something heavier, despair. "You never hugged me, never asked what I was afraid of. All I ever got were orders, fists, and your demand that I become your clone. I tried, God knows I tried. Raise my son to be strong. But maybe all I've done is repeat the very thing I used to hate." Gerald didn't respond. He turned and walked away, leaving behind only one sentence. "What a shame. A Sloan never cries in front of others." Later that same afternoon, Lisa sat across from attorney Alex Hamilton. Flipping through pages of the case file, her face had noticeably thinned, but there was a steely focus in her eyes, something that hadn't been there in years. Alex said, "To win full custody of Ethan, we need to prove that the abuse in the household wasn't just occasional, it was part of a pattern." Lisa nodded. "Then I need to speak with the only person who ever said it out loud, Mrs. Cecilia." Cecilia Evans, the housekeeper who'd been let go 2 years ago, now lived in the southern suburbs. Her apartment was small but tidy. Lavender was drying on the porch. On the shelf, a framed family portrait sat beside a photo of Ethan playing in the garden. Lisa arrived late in the afternoon. Cecilia opened the door, momentarily surprised. But after a second, when she saw Lisa's eyes, she exhaled quietly and stepped aside to let her in. In the living room, when Lisa said, "My son almost died because of Marcus, and I need to know if there's anything you've never told anyone." Cecilia stared down at the teacup in her hands for a long time. "There were nights I heard Ethan crying in his room, but Marcus wouldn't let me go in. He said it was character training. Once, I saw Ethan locked in the storage room just for spilling a glass of water. I thought about reporting it to Child Protective Services, but Marcus warned me. He said if I ever interfered in their family business again, I'd lose my job and wouldn't find work anywhere else. I was scared, so I kept quiet." Cecilia clasped her hands tightly. Her voice dropped, barely above a whisper, meant only for Lisa. "There were nights I heard Ethan crying in his room, but Marcus would lock the door, saying it was reaction training. One time I saw the boy shut in the storage room just because he spilled some water. I wanted to call Child Protective Services, but Marcus threatened me. Said I'd lose my job and my reputation if I dared to meddle in their family matters. I was afraid." Lisa said nothing. The memories rushed back like scissors tearing through her mind. The day Mrs. Cecilia had timidly hinted that Ethan might be treated too harshly, she had brushed it aside. Back then, Lisa still believed Marcus was trying his best, believed he was just parenting in his own way. She hadn't listened. Lisa lowered her head. Guilt rose in her like a tide. "I know, and that's why I need to make it right." Cecilia said nothing. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a handwritten letter she had once intended to send, but never dared. Inside were detailed notes of Marcus's troubling behaviors, each incident dated and recorded. By the end of the day, Inspector Sarah Marino stepped into the interrogation room again. She said nothing, just placed a small mirror on the table, reflecting Marcus's gaunt face, the dark circles under his eyes, his disheveled hair. Then she pressed play on a video from the hospital's security footage. Ethan, barely conscious, whispered as he came to. His eyes, cloudy with pain, scanned the room, searching for someone. He didn't ask for his mom. Didn't ask for medicine. He asked, "Is Dad mad at me?" Marcus went rigid. Sarah's voice was soft, but it landed heavy. "You've become the perfect copy of your father, but that child, he's still hoping for a different kind of dad." Lisa, carrying Cecilia's letter, returned to the attorney's office. She placed it on Alex's desk. "Now I have everything, not just to sue, but to end this cycle once and for all." Marcus, alone in his cell, leaned his forehead against the small mirror bolted to the steel door. The harsh fluorescent light bathed his face, exposing every sign of exhaustion, lines he'd never noticed, sunken eyes, dry lips, unable to form one more excuse. But in the mirror, he didn't see only himself. It wasn't the face of 37-year-old Marcus that stared back. It was a pair of deep, round brown eyes, Ethan's eyes, quiet, heavy, not angry, just filled with a child's disappointment too raw to name. Marcus stumbled back. His heart pounded in his chest like it might shatter the suffocating silence. He shut his eyes, but the image stayed. The backyard gate slamming shut when he was 7, the sound of military boots fading into the dark, and himself curled up behind the wall, sobbing without a sound. Going still the moment his father's voice hissed from the living room. "Cry again and the punishment doubles. Sloanes are not weak." He had learned how to hold back tears, then taught his son to do the same. He thought that was how you protect your child. But now, in the warped reflection of the fogged glass, Marcus saw it clearly. The only thing he had truly passed down was the fear he had never escaped. For the first time in his life, Marcus turned away from the mirror, not because he was ashamed in front of anyone else, but because he no longer had the courage to face himself. Tuesday morning, a fine mist of drizzle clung to the large glass windows of Franklin Hospital like a veil of smoke. Lisa pulled her coat tightly around her hair slightly damp from the light rain, as she carried Ethan from the car up to the 4th floor, the children's psychological care unit. Her arms held him close, as if letting go would unleash a pain she wasn't ready to face. The 4th floor hallway was painted a soft, calming shade of green, but it did nothing to ease the tension gripping Lisa's shoulders. Each footstep echoed faintly, pressing into the hollow ache inside her. Ethan nestled against her chest, silent, his small hand clenching the fabric of her coat in an instinctive grasp. The therapy room wasn't crowded. A therapist gently guided Lisa to seat Ethan at a small art table, set with boxes of crayons, blank sheets of paper, and a few soft toys. Lisa sat a few steps away, not resting her back against the chair, her hands tightly entwined. Her mind wasn't in the room, it was still caught somewhere else. In a holding cell, Marcus received word from the guard. The officer's voice was dry and flat. Lisa Sloane requested a private visit, no attorney, no glass partition. Marcus looked up, blinked once, and gave a slight nod. The visitation room was cold, 2 metal chairs facing each other across a low table. No one said a word when Lisa entered. She wore a long coat, her face pale, bare of makeup, dark circles shadowing her eyes from too many sleepless nights, but her gaze was sharp, cold. There was no hesitation left in it. The guard finished his check and stepped out. The iron door shut with a deep, weighted sound, like a quiet verdict. Marcus spoke first, his lips curling into a weak, almost mocking smile. "You came to hear me apologize?" Lisa didn't answer right away. She remained standing, eyes fixed on him. "I came to see how a father almost let his own child die." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper. She opened it and laid it on the table. It was Ethan's drawing, a glass of milk crossed out with red, and a dark cloud stretching over the heads of a mother and child. Marcus glanced over, but his eyes no longer held that same defiance. Something had slackened, like a wire pulled too tight for too long, finally snapping. Lisa drew a breath, her voice steady but weighted with each word. "You know what you did. There's no denying it anymore. Ethan's awake, he told me. He's sorry for revealing the secret. Do you understand? That boy, he's not afraid to die. He's only afraid his own father doesn't love him." The words echoed through the silent room, like a hammer striking metal. Marcus lowered his head. He didn't speak, didn't gasp for air, but his shoulders began to tremble slightly. Something, maybe genuine remorse, cracked at the corners of his eyes. Lisa turned and walked out without looking back. When the steel door closed behind her, Marcus dropped his head onto the table and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in his life, there was no excuse left strong enough to save him from himself. At that same moment, in the therapy room on the 4th floor, Ethan picked up a crayon and drew the first strokes on a blank sheet of paper. It wasn't like the drawings he used to make. Not superheroes, not cars, not Christmas trees. This time it was a small, low house. Above it, black rain, and out front a blurry figure standing at a distance. The doctor sitting beside him asked gently, "Who do you think that shadow is, Ethan?" Ethan looked up, hesitating. "I don't know, but I think maybe it's Dad," his voice caught. From across the room, Lisa heard him. Her eyes welled up. Ethan looked down, his hand clutching the crayon tightly. "I'm afraid he's mad at me, but I still love him." The doctor nodded slowly. "Your dad did something that made you sad, didn't he? But drawing how you feel, that's a brave thing to do. When we understand and name our fears, they don't feel so big anymore." Ethan didn't reply. He just kept drawing, quietly. He added a soft orange circle around the figures of his mother and himself, then lightly shaded over the dark shape outside the door, as if he were pushing it farther away. Lisa came closer, knelt beside him, and whispered, "I'm here, and I know you still love your dad. But love doesn't mean letting someone hurt you, Ethan." Ethan turned to look at her, then gave a small nod, the slightest nod, but the clearest one Lisa had ever seen. That night, after Lisa brought Ethan back to her mother's apartment, she opened her laptop, plugged in her headphones, and quietly watched a video from the year before. Marcus was yelling in the living room, "Don't cry like a girl. You think life's going to go easy on you? You need to learn how to take it, Ethan. Do you understand me?" Lisa paused the video. Her hand tightened around the mouse, her palm damp with sweat. Downstairs, her mother was reheating soup. Ethan had already fallen asleep. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. At the detention center, Marcus was still sitting there. The drawing Ethan had made had been confiscated by the guards, but the image of the milk glass crossed out in red was burned into his mind. He looked into the small mirror on the back of the cell door. But the reflection wasn't him. It was Ethan's wide, young eyes, not angry, just quietly disappointed. Marcus turned away, not out of shame, but because he no longer had the courage to face himself. And from the darkness of memory, his father's voice, Gerald Sloan, echoed like a strike on steel. "Cry again and your punishment doubles. Sloans don't get soft." That's when Marcus understood. He wasn't just losing the right to be a father. He was paying the price for a lifetime of going against everything he once believed in. At 20, he'd been a quiet young man full of longing for a family where he wouldn't flinch every time his father came home, where silence wasn't mistaken for weakness. When he met Lisa, her gentleness had felt like a sliver of light cutting through the heavy dark of his childhood. Back then he made a promise. If he ever had a child, he'd protect them with the kind of love he'd never known. But Gerald still came around, still looked at Ethan with the same contempt, still used that same heavy voice. "If you're soft, life'll crush you." Under pressure and confusion, Marcus began to doubt the very belief he'd once clung to. He never hit his son, but he shouted. He forced Ethan into silence. He repeated the voice he had once feared, as if he'd been programmed to become his father's second edition. Now, in the stillness of that mirror, Marcus didn't see a father. He saw his son's face, those eyes filled with wordless disappointment. He turned away, his chest tight, not out of guilt, but because, finally, he could no longer pretend he didn't know what he'd become. There were no grand banners at the county courthouse that morning, no jostling crowd of reporters, but inside, a trial was taking place, one that could redefine the meaning of fatherhood and responsibility. Marcus Sloan was brought into the courtroom wearing a prison jumpsuit, unnervingly calm. He had refused legal representation, a decision that made even the prosecutor raise an eyebrow. Lisa sat in the gallery, eyes fixed on the man who once held the title of her child's father. "The defendant confirms he is representing himself?" the judge asked. Marcus nodded. "I don't need anyone to defend what I've done." The trial moved into the evidentiary phase. A large screen lit up, playing a recording from Lisa's phone, Marcus's voice shouting at his son. "Stop crying like a girl. You think life's going to go easy on you? You have to learn how to take it, Ethan." The sharpness of his words echoed through the courtroom. Heads bowed. A few people hissed through clenched teeth in outrage. Then came Ethan's drawing, a picture of a mother holding her child under black rain, with the faint silhouette of a man standing just beyond the threshold, blurred and distant. Lisa was called to the stand. She carried the framed drawing with her, setting it down carefully. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. My son whispered 3 words. He didn't fully understand them, but he knew something wasn't right, and he had the courage to speak up. If my child could do that in fear and in pain, then I, as an adult, have no excuse to stay silent. Immediately afterward, an unexpected witness was called. Mrs. Cecilia Evans, the former housekeeper who had worked in Marcus's home for nearly 2 years. Lisa looked up, exhaling like someone finally severing a tie to the past. Mrs. Cecilia stepped forward, silver-haired, small in frame, but her eyes were clear and bright. The prosecutor asked, "Mrs. Evans, you were employed in the Sloan household. Did you ever witness behavior that was inappropriate toward the child?" She nodded, her voice steady but slightly hoarse. "There were nights I heard Ethan crying alone in his room. I wanted to go in, but Marcus threatened to fire me if I interfered with how others raise their children. One time the boy was locked in the storage room just because he didn't arrange the blocks by color. I wanted to speak up, but he threatened me, and I was afraid of losing my job. When I told Miss Lisa, she didn't believe me. Back then she still trusted him too much, still loved him too much." Lisa bowed her head, eyes tightly shut. No one in the courtroom spoke. Marcus, standing behind the defendant's wooden enclosure, looked at Mrs. Cecilia, then at Lisa. No one turned away. No one shielded him from the weight of his own actions. The judge called the final witness, Mr. Gerald Sloan, Marcus's father. He rose, adjusted the lapel of his worn leather jacket, and answered the prosecutor in a voice cold as steel. "I taught my son to be strong, no crying, no whining. That's how I was raised, and I don't regret it." "Did you ever strike or confine Marcus as a form of discipline?" the prosecutor asked. "I did what I had to do to teach him how to survive." In that moment, Marcus fell utterly still. His shoulders sagged, his hands clutched one another tightly. The judge invited Marcus to make a final statement. He stood, lifted his gaze to Lisa, the woman who now met his eyes with unwavering resolve, no tears left to cry. "I used to think I was teaching my son to be tough. But the truth is, I was just passing on my own wounds to a child. I'm sorry, Lisa. And I'm sorry, Ethan. Not because I was convicted, but because now I understand. I was wrong, and I have to pay for it." A heavy silence filled the room. Then the sound of the gavel struck through. Marcus Sloan, on the charges of willfully endangering the life of a minor and inflicting long-term psychological harm, this court sentences you to 6 years in prison. During that time, you are prohibited from contacting the victim by any means. No letters, no visits, no communication of any kind. Custody is granted to the biological mother, Ms. Lisa Thompson. Not a single clap was heard, but in the gallery, a few people nodded quietly. Lisa sat still, her hands holding Ethan's picture frame, as if cradling a part of the past that had to be protected forever. Marcus turned away as the bailiffs approached. But before leaving the courtroom, he looked toward his father, one last time. "I'll raise Ethan differently than you raised me." Gerald said nothing, but in that moment, for the first time, his gaze slowed and blinked, like a hairline crack forming in a wall of lifelong stubbornness. Outside, the sun was mild. Lisa stepped down the courthouse steps without looking back. The light had finally reached the darkest corner of her life, and this time, it would not be hidden again. A week after the trial, Lisa took Ethan to his scheduled therapy session. The boy was doing much better, eating well, sleeping through the night, and rarely waking up startled anymore. But to Lisa, something still hadn't been released. A question, a faint echo that Ethan refused to speak aloud, holding on to it like a tiny fist clinging to a rainstorm. That day, while waiting in the counseling room, Lisa received a call from attorney Alex. "The detention center just reached out. Marcus wants to register a family visitor. And it's Ethan." Lisa was silent for a long time, so long that Alex thought the call had dropped. "I'll go with him," she finally said. Just this once. The county jail sat outside the city, tucked between rows of grey walls like a space the world had forgotten. Ethan didn't fully understand what was happening, only that he was about to see his father. Lisa had reminded him over and over, "Only say what you want to say. No one's going to make you do anything." The visitation room had no glass partition. A guard stood outside. Marcus was brought in, wearing a prison uniform, his hands free of cuffs but his face visibly thinner. When he saw Ethan, he stopped in his tracks. The boy hesitated, hiding behind his mother's leg. Marcus sat down first, placing his hands gently on the table, as if afraid the movement might scare his son. "Hi, buddy," he said softly. His voice had lost its confidence. It was dry, distant. Lisa gave Ethan a gentle nudge on the shoulder. The boy slowly stepped forward and climbed into the seat across from his father. He said nothing. His eyes blinked quickly, then settled on the familiar face that now seemed so far away. After a moment, Ethan reached into his small backpack and pulled out a piece of paper, folded in quarters. He set it on the table and pushed it forward. "I made a picture for you." Marcus unfolded the paper. A simple house, blue sky, Lisa and Ethan holding hands on the porch. In the distance, the figure of a man stood outside the gate. Not crossed out, just standing, outside. "I drew you standing far away, because I still miss you. But I don't like it when you yell." Marcus swallowed hard. His eyes turned red, not from being judged, not from the loss, but because this child, the one he used to think of as fragile, was the one teaching him what strength truly meant. "I was wrong, Ethan," he said softly. "I thought being a man meant teaching you to be tough. But I forgot that before you can be strong, you need to feel loved." Ethan didn't fully understand, but he gave a small smile, not because he had forgiven, more because his father had finally learned how to bow his head. Lisa stood up, resting her hand on their son's shoulder, but Ethan stayed seated, still looking at Marcus. After a brief pause, he asked in a quiet voice, "Are you still mad at me for telling them?" Marcus looked up, his voice tight with emotion. "No, son, I'm not mad. I'm just angry at myself for making you feel afraid." Ethan gave a slight nod, as if that was all he needed to hear. He glanced at the drawing on the table, then added, "I still want you to come home, but Mummy says we only let good people into our house. So you have to learn how to be a good person first." The innocent remark sliced into Marcus like a quiet blade, exposing the truth he hadn't yet faced. He bowed his head, saying nothing more. The door creaked open. A guard stepped in, voice gentle but firm. "Visiting time's over. Please exit the room." Lisa leaned down and took her son's hand. "It's time to go, Ethan." Before leaving, she gave Marcus one last look. Not of blame, not of forgiveness, just a quiet confirmation. The past was closed, and anyone who still wanted to walk beside them would have to step out of the shadows they'd made for themselves. Ethan still remembers you, Marcus, but the memories he keeps, that's up to you. I won't stop him from loving his father, but don't expect me to ever give you another chance to hurt him again. Marcus gave a slight nod. He knew he had nothing to argue. And for the first time, without needing it spelled out, he understood. Adults don't always get second chances, especially when what's lost is a child's innocence. That afternoon, the court officially ruled, Lisa was granted full custody of Ethan. Marcus lost visitation rights for the duration of his sentence. After completing his term, any contact would require supervision and mandatory therapy. That night, Ethan sat at the table with his drawing pad. He made a new picture. A house with a front porch. No more rain, no shadows. Just him and his mom. He added a gate, slightly open. Outside the gate, his father's figure was still there, but this time there was a small yellow circle above his head, like the first light of morning. Lisa taped the drawing to the fridge. She stood there looking at it for a long time. Inside, she didn't feel quite relieved, but she felt at peace. Not because she had won, but because, after everything, Ethan was still a child who knew how to love, how to forgive, and how to keep his distance from pain. 1 year later, spring light quietly spilled across the dome of the city's community center, where Lisa and Ethan were getting ready to step onto a small stage. They were no longer victims. They were witnesses to the power of speaking up, of truth, and of courage. Beneath the stage sat dozens of people, parents, social workers, teachers, and children nestled beside their mothers and fathers. In one corner, a woman held her 3-year-old in her arms, her shoulders trembling slightly as Lisa's gaze met hers. Alex Hamilton opened the talk. He introduced Lisa as someone who had transformed a personal experience into a community call to action. Someone whose voice had forced the legal system to take more seriously the quiet whispers of a child. Lisa rose, microphone in hand. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady and clear. "A year ago, my son whispered 3 words. They weren't shouted. There was no physical evidence, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks, enough to make me look again. Not just at the man beside me, but at myself. What had I let slip by without speaking up?" She glanced down at Ethan in the front row. He waved at her, his smile bright, his eyes confident, so different from the boy who once flinched from the light. Lisa continued, "We teach our children to obey, but sometimes they need to be taught not to stay silent. We think love means protecting them, but often love means believing they can speak and truly listening even when what they say is hard to hear." As she stepped down, Ethan was invited to share a few words. He shifted a bit, then walked up, holding a drawing. "I used to have a secret I shouldn't have kept, and when I told it, I was scared. But my mom didn't get mad. She listened, and I felt lighter. Now I know. Telling was the best thing I ever did." The room held its breath for a few moments, then burst into applause. A little girl, sitting beside her mother, leaned in and whispered, "Mom, can I tell too?" Her mother nodded. On the bus ride home, as they sat side by side on the bench seat, Ethan rested his head on Lisa's shoulder. "Mom, what if next time I tell someone and they don't believe me?" Lisa placed her hand gently on his soft hair. "Then go ahead and tell your story. I'll stand behind you, for as long as it takes for them to listen. And even if they don't, I'll still be here, hearing every word." The boy smiled faintly. The picture he drew today was of a house, this time without rain, without shadows. Just his mom, Ethan, and a narrow path leading out to the garden, where the last light of the day fell gently on each pebble. Because sometimes, light doesn't need to shout to be seen. It only needs to stop being hidden. Today's story might leave us speechless, not just because of what happened, but because of how a small child found the courage to speak up at his most vulnerable moment. Ethan didn't just save himself. He stirred something deep within his family, something that made them pause, look inward, and start again in a better way. There are wounds that can't be erased, but they can be transformed into strength if we're brave enough to face the truth. What do you think of Lisa's choice? The mother who once stayed silent, once hesitated, but ultimately chose to stand by her son. And how do you feel about Marcus, a man scarred by his past, who couldn't find his way to love his child the right way? Would you forgive, or would you take the lesson to heart and carry it forward in your own life? Thank you for staying with us through to the end of this story. Are you doing okay? Is life treating you gently these days? If something has been weighing on your heart, please remember, you're not alone. Here we listen together, not to judge, but to understand.